I do all my flyouts to other places, and they're listening to me talk about pensions and the importance. And when I talk about pensions, the enthusiasm wasn't as lively. And so when I came to interview and present my research here, it was just so funny how many people were at the edge of their seat asking me questions. And I was off guard. I was like, I didn't realize how interested you'd be. And immediately they were like, no, this is relevant to our policy right now.
All we talk about is pensions and retirement. So welcome to Alaska. Welcome to the East Anchorage Book Club. I'm your host, Andrew Gray. The purpose of this podcast is to tell the stories of Alaskans of interest and importance. Today, our guest is Dr. Brock Wilson, who is the newest researcher at UAA's Institute of Social and Economic Research, commonly referred to as ISER. Brock recently earned his PhD in economics from the University of Oregon, where his primary area of research was retirement and pensions. It was his work as a wildland firefighter that initially got him involved in recruitment and retention policy that ultimately led to his focus on retirements and pensions. Dr. Brock Wilson, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here.
So where did you grow up?
I'm originally from Tillamook, Oregon. Have you, by chance, heard of Tillamook cheese?
Yes.
So that's where I'm originally from, but I moved to Corvallis at a young age. I grew up there. And then from there, I went to undergrad at University of Oregon and then did my PhD at the University of Oregon.
Yeah, I just looked at your resume. So I just saw that you did undergrad, master's, PhD, all at the same institution.
Yeah.
And you were an econ major as an undergrad and continued all the way through your PhD in econ.
It's actually a funny story. I went into undergrad wanting to be a doctor. I wanted to be a teacher. And then I wanted to do math. And all the while in the summers, I was doing wildland firefighting. And so I ended up being like, oh, I'll just be a wildland firefighter. I'll work in forestry. So I spent 5 summers. I graduated with my degree in econ and math. And it was my first year out of undergrad. I got a full-time job as a forest officer. And it's a wonderful job. I love that job. But part of the job was that after I graduated and I was working full-time, I was stationed in a remote area where literally was in a cabin in the woods. And so in that moment, I had 2 things happen. One was I love this job. I'd love to keep doing it. But also in that same space, I was like, I actually think I'd love to do a little bit more in sort of the policy side. And in that whirlwind of about 4 months, I was putting together my GRE and applying to places. And I actually had no intention of going into econ. But I guess a little bit of background is I had a junior year, a professor who came to me and said, you should consider doing a master's or a PhD. And nobody in particular in my family had done that and ever thought about it. And when he said that, I thought, yeah, I'd like to go and do some graduate work and get further into this. So I emailed him. He wrote me a letter. I applied widely. And then I got accepted to the University of Oregon. And he became my advisor.
Who is he?
Glenn Waddell.
And what's his specialty?
He's a labor, education, public economist, health economist. He's done a lot of work in a lot of areas. I would say education is definitely something he's very good at, but he's a sharp man. So in the last 3 years working under him, he's taught me a lot of skills that have been really important to me.
The way I found out about you was there was another ISER economist in this office yesterday afternoon and said that ISER had hired a new economist and that his specialty was retirements and pensions. And so I, of course, said, oh, that guy needs to come on the podcast. And you happen to be at the building today. So we're doing this podcast pretty spontaneously. How does, your forester, your econ advisor, his education, how did you end up doing pensions and retirements?
It's a really funny story. I started working on papers related to forestry and thinking about places that had deficits where there was a shortage of forestry workers. Was there more likely to be higher likely of a wildland fire? And as I was working through that, I got this.
Is there?
I don't have an answer yet, but I would say theoretically it should be the case. And there's an interesting thing there in my own experience with the Oregon Department of Forestry where there were a large turnover. We're talking about like 60% of staff are leaving and they're either moving to another place or they're going out because it's seasonal work. Mm-hmm. And so retaining forestry workers is really challenging. And so I was very interested to say, places that just don't even get new people, are they really struggling with fires? No answer yet. Would love to get back to that research. While I was working on that and thinking about it and trying to model it, I got some great federal payroll data. And so I was looking at that data and I saw, oh, wow, Alaska and Hawaii gave their workers really great pensions. And it's one of those moments where you have the data, the experiment is in front of you. And for me, I like broadly anything in labor. And I was like, I wonder. And so I started writing that paper. And originally, it was not meant to be my job market paper. What was funny about it is I ended up finishing the paper and I was sending it out to different jobs. And I applied to the University of Alaska Anchorage ISER job. But they had originally wanted a health economist. And so I sent it to them just thinking they're probably not going to interview me. I do all my flyouts to other places and they're listening to me talk about pensions and the importance. And when I talk about pensions, the enthusiasm wasn't as lively. And so when I came to interview or present my research here, it was just so funny how many people were at the edge of their seat asking me questions. And I was off guard. I was like, I didn't realize how interested you'd be. And immediately they were like, no, this is relevant to our policy right now.
How long have you been in Alaska exactly?
August 11th is technically.
All we talk about is pensions and retirement. It's like a lot of pension and retirement talk.
Yeah.
All the time. So welcome to Alaska. You applied to the right place at the right time.
It worked out really well. They ended up opening a second position and brought me in, and I was very thankful. I cannot say how grateful I am working with the people I work with. You've already, Brett and Mike today, but I could go on. Everybody in that.
So Brett Watson, former podcast guest. Mike Jones, former podcast guest. Yeah. Dana DeFeo, former podcast guest. Who's your boss? Diane Hirschberg, former podcast guest. There's a lot of you guys have been on the pod. Oh, and we had the mining guy, Bob Leffler, former podcast guest. I'm making my way through the entire ISER faculty.
For me, when I'm working, one of the beautiful things I think about ISER is that we specialize in areas that are niche. It's like when I came in and I was talking about pensions, a lot of people are like, I've never really thought about it. But it's also wonderful because I can sit down with Brett or Mike and they'll just go through oil, for example. The economics of oil are so fascinating. And Brett sometimes I'm like, no, we actually have to stop talking, I have to work. But it's so cool. And I think that's one of the beautiful things about ISER is just the exposure to some of these topics, but also the ability to go across and mesh into new research ideas because of that. I think it's a really exciting place for me just because I like that sort of collaboration.
It's a cool entity and it was established by the legislature, and Vic Fisher, who helped establish it in the legislature, was the first executive director, and he's a former podcast guest.
I'm honored to be here.
Hey, what did your parents do?
So my mom was a beautician and then she went to school and became a civil engineer. So she works for the federal highway. She was in the state of Oregon and she was the highway safety engineer. And now she's transitioned into the feds. And then my dad is a cost estimator for the state of Oregon. He's doing a lot of thinking about the bids and making sure that the estimates coming from them are accurate.
And they still live in the town you grew up in?
Corvallis, yeah.
Did you move to Alaska by yourself?
Yeah.
Okay, so you're single.
Yep. Yeah.
Good luck.
I've had some interesting and funny takes on it, but I don't know. It's been a wonderful place. And again, the community here is truly, I think, it's so open. And like when I first came up here, all the faculty were like, we're going to have you over for a barbecue. And then they're like, we have all these guests coming over. I've become already so ingrained that I'm like, I actually need to like take a step back. I have things I have to do.
Are you 32?
I'm 28.
You're 28.
Yeah.
Oh my God, I was trying to total up your years of school.
Yeah, no.
But
I went straight from undergrad into a PhD. And I will say it's funny, when I first presented my paper on pensions, one of the people that came in was like, I would never have expected you to work on pensions. But the more I've done work on it, the more I've been actually really interested. And I'll talk about it more later, but it's kind of, I think, just such a rich topic.
Were your parents supportive of you moving to Alaska?
100%. My dad was stationed here in Kodiak when he was in the Coast Guard. And so when I first got the job offer, I called my mom and I was like, I got a job offer in Alaska. And my mom was like, you have family up there, your dad's been there. And my dad was like, you don't have a choice, like you have to go. They drove up with me. It was me, my brother, my mom, my dad. We got into a Tacoma and packed up all my stuff in a U-Haul, drove up together. They spent 2 weeks with me here, They went home and they flew back from, maybe it was Veterans Day. And they were like, we're going to come back up again. And I was like, no, wait till next June.
So let's talk about retirements and pension.
Of course.
I have your paper from November 2023, Retirement, Retention, Recruitment, Evidence from a Federal Pension Policy. I guess you want to talk a little bit about that paper, because I assume that was the paper that got you, your job here.
Absolutely.
So tell us about that paper.
Yeah, as I said earlier, it just came out of, I don't know, just like it was there, the experiment had been done. And what I originally approached my advisor about it, he was like, I wonder what effects on the workforce. And so a little context to the policy.
So basically for listeners, your question was, does having a more generous pension, what effect does that have on the workforce? Does it enable people to hire more workers? Does it keep people at the job longer? What are the effects of making an area that already has a pension have a more generous pension? Exactly. So it's not a directly applicable question for what we have in Alaska's for our state employees right now.
Exactly. Yeah. The context of the policy was that the Non-Foreign Area Retirement Equity Assurance Act rolled out because workers in Alaska and Hawaii were not eligible for a particular type of pay that would be used in the calculation of their salaries for their benefits. And Congress passed this bill, and the whole point was it was going to increase pensions by about 20% for these workers. And the number off the top of my head, I can't remember, but it's about $100,000 is what I did the calculation in terms of like the annuity you would have received over time.
Over time. I was a little bit confused. I skimmed your paper. I saw that $100,000 figure, but it's like they get $100,000 in the course of their retirement.
Exactly.
So like from when they retire till when they die.
If you go from 60 to 80,000.
Yes.
That's 20,000. And in this case, if you live for 20 more years, that's 400,000 for each worker.
Gotcha. It varied.
Exactly. It's 20% more in terms of whatever salary.
Gotcha.
And in some ways, this is a very large, it's a huge increase. $20 more thousand in annuity in a year is quite substantial for somebody who's retired. And so I think the first thing we were interested, actually, there's a New York Times paper on this. They wrote about how when this policy first rolled out, you had to wait 3 years to get the full benefit. And so if you were going to retire next year, it wouldn't work. You wouldn't get any benefits. You needed to wait the full 3 years because they had this slow transition. And so a lot of federal workers in Alaska, they didn't retire. They held out. And so what happened is...
for an extra 3 years so that they would qualify for this extra 20%, because who wouldn't?
Exactly. And so you see in the data, there's this large spike right when the first day of 3 years passes. Everybody retires. And so there was a New York Times paper about how all of these federal agencies were scrambling. They literally could not get... all the senior management left.
Right. But it's a one-off issue.
Exactly.
Because from once those people who had planned on retired but had held off for an extra 3 years, once they're gone, then you should see a more regular retirement process.
Yeah, it was this transition in human capital, thinking about older managers. You need people to leave the workforce to have people come in.
And I guess just because most of the people who listen to my podcast work in state government. And so we're not federal workers. So I guess, can you explain who are the workers that we're talking about?
Largely, when I think about Alaskan federal workers, we're thinking about the Forest Service, the Bureau of Land Management, like those sets of workers. I would not do justice to all of the set of workers.
But your specific interest was with forestry, and so that's like your perspective. So
that's exactly what the New York Times article is talking about. Is basically all of
the forestry people retired.
They retired, and they couldn't find. They literally had no transition plan. They were like scrambling to get people to come in.
And what year did this big increase happen?
Started in 2010, and it topped out in 2013.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
And it's still in place today.
It is still in place.
Spoiler alert. I mean, I read your conclusion.
Yeah.
So the conclusion is that your most knowledgeable, most experienced workers will stay until they collect their pension, is how I read your conclusion. But there was not good data to show that this big increase in a more robust pension system enabled them to hire more new workers. So it wasn't really attracting a larger application pool for new employees, but it did help you keep your most valuable workers until the end.
And so I think that's the part of the paper that was, I think, the most interesting from a behavioral standpoint, The retention piece, I think people largely agree with, but the hiring piece is something I'm trying to work more on, to think a little bit about, because whether it's dollars, pensions, health insurance, it's all compensation. And so if we're giving workers more compensation or providing better compensation, one of the thoughts is you'd see maybe people with more education coming into the workforce. Maybe you'd see people with more years of experience coming into the workforce. Maybe they're type of workers who prefer pensions. And maybe you see that in something like age demographics. And all of those, I didn't see any effect on that. And I think that's one of the things that's in the part of the paper where it's hypothesis sort of forming, suggestive of maybe one avenue, and this is just me theorizing, is when you're looking for jobs, it's not well advertised. If you look on Indeed, for example, you might see the wage and you might see a pension included, but the generosity of the pension.
Right. So you're not really able to compare pensions because it may not be being disclosed at all. It also may not be particularly what younger workers look at, period.
It could be yeah.
And I guess for full transparency, I think when we talk about pensions in Alaska and basically what happened in 2006 when we went from a defined benefit to a defined contribution, and there are other factors at play and why we don't have as many teachers in Alaska as we used to. But I think people may, from your research, may be putting more eggs in the pension basket than they should, because it's possible that returning to a defined benefit won't necessarily increase the number of new applicants, new teachers, or brand new police officers, or brand new firefighters, because they may be attracted by higher pay, period, like what they're getting paid now. They're not interested in delayed gratification, how much they're going to get when they retire. And I think we see that in the higher paying jobs like police officers in Anchorage. What I've learned from talking to police officers is that they feel like their starting pay is very competitive. They're very happy with it. But I think that once they get a little older, they have kids, they have a family, they start thinking about, I'm not going to be able to do this forever. What's my life going to look like? Then I think the calculus of, if I had a pension coming, that would be worthwhile. Maybe it's time that I look someplace where I could get a pension. And then you don't keep those well-trained, experienced officers as long.
I think to extrapolate a little bit here from my prior research, there's good theory to think that defined benefits are good at retaining workers. And the suggestive of the paper for me is I find that increasing pensions do lead to retaining workers. The evidence base for thinking about the hiring and pensions, first off, it's actually, there's not a lot out there on this. When I was originally doing my literature review for this, I found a paper, I believe from 1986 from Alan Kruger. The paper was looking at when there was change in fringe benefits, health insurance, pensions, were there more or less job applicants for federal jobs? And his whole point was no. And I think it makes me think really much in line with this. Maybe these fringe benefits, they're not as salient, or maybe they're not clique preferences. But as you're saying, as people go through their career, when they're thinking about retention, as they go along, it becomes much more of a pressing issue.
And I'll speak for myself. I'm not somebody who reads fine print. I never read the manuals that come with any appliance that I buy in my house. I just hit buttons and try to figure it out and see what happens. And that's how I've done my jobs over the years. I don't really pay attention to which healthcare plan I've signed up for. I figure it out when I have to go to the emergency room. And then I'm like, oh man, this policy sucks. What did I sign up for? Or what have I done? You know what I mean? And I think like I'm not the only person who does that. And so I think some people don't really take a look at their pension plan until years later. And then they realize that they, took a job that doesn't have a good pension plan or doesn't have one at all. And so it doesn't surprise me that there was that finding from that particular researcher that fringe benefits weren't having a big effect.
I think it's one of those moments where maybe economics has to think a little harder because we have this traditional theory, wages earned, compensation. And it's like, no, it doesn't seem like that. And we're working on research on that. which is that people rely on heuristics when they're looking at jobs. Does it have a pension?
Right.
Does it have health insurance? And if you check the box, then that's where it is. But how generous it is.
And I think when you have a job that has really great health insurance, for example, your employer is paying a high premium to provide that benefit to you. I don't know anyone who thinks about their salary and adds on that premium that their employer is paying. You know what I'm saying? As being part of their salary.
Right.
Whereas from the employer's perspective, it absolutely is part of the salary. That's how much they're having to pay out for that employee.
Exactly.
They think that employee is getting paid $180,000 a year.
Right.
The employee thinks they're getting paid $150,000 a year or whatever it might be.
Right.
And so you think of your salary as being $150, but really there's this hidden $30,000 in there that's being paid on your behalf for benefits that, I don't know, if you're 28, you may not use at all or care about.
And I think to go another step here is that anecdotally, at least, I've heard people close to me say, oh, private sector pays better than federal jobs. And when you include these fringe benefits, when you include healthcare and you include pensions, it's actually the case that federal is like number 2 for the highest paid industry. I think it's tech that's number 1. But if you look at raw salary, it's probably like 10 or 12.
But because the benefits are so great, it makes it so much more expensive for the employer. In this case, that employer is the federal government. So no one cares really.
And so that sort of mentality, I think, is what maybe transpires into job searches, right? Oh, I could go work for the feds or the public sector, but I'm going to be taking a huge pay cut. But if you don't step and think about, oh, it's actually the whole compensation. Like I've heard, even from my parents, they're public workers. They're like, oh, I could just go work for the private industry and make more money.
You could make more money, but you would have worse benefits. Or you'd have to pay for your own benefits. That would be a loss of salary.
On average. That's, I think, an important narrative that's really crucial to thinking about this sort of package.
Yeah, no, that's really important. Are you following the politics of returning to a defined benefit in Alaska right now?
We are working on research in this space. Very interested in that. There are a few bills coming out related to this that we are interested in thinking about and understanding.
Have you looked at the current bill that's being heard in the Senate and the House right now to return to a defined benefit retirement system for Alaska state workers?
Which bill is that one again?
Chuck Copps and Kathy Giesel's.
I have spoken recently with Kathy Giesel about this.
Okay, because I've heard their presentations, and I can quote Kathy Giesel's thing of, this is not your grandfather's pension, that we're doing a much trimmed down conservative pension that's designed to be appealing to fiscal conservatives, that it will not risk ever bankrupting the state. The hope is that actually by keeping our more valuable workers, those with years of experience and training, that we actually save money by implementing this policy. But it seems to me that your paper, at least, is quite different, because your paper is looking at taking a pension system and making it way more generous. Whereas the experiment that we're doing right now is what happens if you go from no pension system to a pension system, to a not overly generous pension system.
Yeah, this is a question that I think a lot of states are having right now. A lot of states right now are in a situation where their defined benefit pensions, they're underfunded. And so this is what's, I think, exciting about this question you're asking, is a lot of states are toying with, why don't we go from defined benefit to defined contribution? But the question every state is asking is, what is it going to do to our workforce? And there's not many states that have done this policy experiment. Alaska and Michigan are two that come to mind that have done the policy experiment. And so the question is very much on people's mind and needs, I think, some answering in terms of, is it going to meaningfully change retention? Is it going to meaningfully change recruitment? And we're eager to continue down this line of work and think about, is it doing that?
Have you done any research on defined contribution and how much it costs and what the actual benefit is to the employee? And I guess the reason why is because one of the arguments that we hear is that if a worker invests their money properly with their defined contribution, it could actually be a more generous retirement for them than the defined benefit. And my guess is that it's probably like a bell curve, And there's probably like some tiny minority of folks who, did some really great investments and really paid off. And they have a lot more money in retirement than they would have had if they'd gone with the traditional pension system. But my bet is that the average worker probably doesn't turn out with more in the end. And definitely there's a higher level of stress by not having that certainty of how much money they will have in their bank account every month.
Conditional on market returns. That's one of the things that research is interested in understanding, is that when you go to these defined contribution systems, retirement is dependent on the market. And so you could imagine one outcome is that if I'm in the defined contribution system and the market's tanked, I'm going to have to work a little bit longer to make sure I can retire with the amount I need. Whereas on the other hand, if the market's doing wonderfully, then I'm going to retire a little earlier because I made it already. And so there's that sort of impact. Whereas the defined benefit, this is the number, just when you're retiring, people, as far as planning can go, is a lot easier. And I think in this space, when we're talking about the two, I think the risk averse, they would prefer that guaranteed, this is the amount. But I will say, we've done a little bit of preliminary work on this. And if you had expected market returns, which the average was like 6.69%, I believe, then you're within a pretty close margin for whether you're the defined benefit or defined contribution. But again, that's conditional on expected market returns. And that's sometimes a challenge for people to want to hear that. Oh, I should be at that level, but you could be in the tail ends of the distribution. And that's, I don't think for people when they're thinking about retirement, they want to hear that.
I worked as a high school teacher for a brief time in Los Angeles, right after college, basically. And I will never forget that there was a teacher there who'd been there for 30 years, and she was like the best teacher. She was like a mentor teacher. She was excellent. She was like really the top of her game. But we were having presentations on how to plan for retirement. And even though I was like 24, I went to the meetings, and I remember that she told me that she invested everything in like government bonds, like these super like low pay, but very low risk investments. And I remember just the discussion around how she was so like people literally saying how stupid she was and how she wasn't doing things correctly and how she should be investing in the stock market. And like, this is the way you get a better return on your investment. And that, you know, in order to retire comfortably, you had to be willing to take some risk. But she was absolutely not. She was like super like, it's gambling and I'm not going to participate in that. It is gambling. Saying, oh, I'm going to buy a whole bunch of this particular stock and hope that it quadruples in value. She's not wrong to say that she's not going to do that because she's morally opposed to gambling. But yet it does feel that the vast majority of people have been rewarded by not behaving like she has, by not investing in the lowest risk investment on the market.
Yeah, I would really be interested to understand and think about how people are investing. I'm not in the finance literature, but I would really be interested to understand how people are choosing and selecting. I know for most plans and defined contribution, they exist this target retirement fund where they smooth and change over from stock to say for as you
right. Yeah, I worked at the Alaska VA, and you pick your account, and people who are more comfortable with more risk pick this one, and it could potentially pay out more. And then they also have these sort of hybrid accounts that would be like retirement 2040, retirement 2045, retirement 2050. And you pick where you think you're going to retire.
Yeah, exactly.
And then you get like the ideal, smooth. You're not going to make as much as somebody who put it all on Apple and Apple quadruple, but you're not also going to lose a ton of money.
It's one of the things you're talking about that is a little concerning. Maybe not. I don't know. It's just that there is the potential for somebody to put all of their retirement on a particular stock and it doesn't pan out, or just the market in general. It comes back to this volatility. And so, again, people's preferences, that's their choice.
Right.
When we're thinking about from a state public workforce standpoint, it's going to affect somebody's retirement decision. And that changes the workforce planning decision. And workers out, workers in. And so, I mean, from that standpoint.
And I've heard it from more than one teacher that they have a hard enough job doing their lesson plans, doing their grading, planning to be the best teacher they can be.
Yeah.
That they don't need to be spending their weekend learning how to be an investor on the stock market.
Yeah.
So that they can maximize their retirement account.
Yeah. I mean, it's when I first came to ISER and I told people I studied pensions, everybody in the hall was like, can you give me a little help and advice on what I should be doing? In fact, I can tell you a really funny anecdote. I went into the airport, I was flying home, and I was sitting there and I was eating a burger. And this nice lady came up and she started talking to me and she was telling me about her work. And she asked what I did. And so I said, I'm really excited. I got a job here. I'll be a professor and I'm working, on retirement and pensions. And she's like, what's your email? And I was like, I'm going to send you my portfolio. I want you to tell me if I'm doing a good job. And I was like, no.
That's not what I do. Yeah.
I was like, I cannot give you financial advice. But I have a lot of people, even the thing right now with health insurance plans, it's the same. There's some sort of parallel I could go about in thinking about fringe benefits. But I have a lot of people in the hall who will be like, well, what do you think of these health insurance plans, these high premium?
So it sounds like ISER had planned on hiring a healthcare policy person. They hired you.
And they hired a healthcare policy economist.
Oh, who's that?
Spencer Parrott. He'll be here in a year. He's actually right now doing a postdoc in Los Angeles.
Okay.
Yeah.
I definitely need to meet with Spencer.
Absolutely.
This office is working on healthcare policy.
He's a very easy to get to know person, and I know he'll be very excited. He has research already on this topic about I think the Affordable Care Act. Don't quote me on that.
No, for sure. Because the United States spends too much money on healthcare and does not get a good return on that investment. And Alaska in particular does the same thing. Mm-hmm. And so trying to figure out ways to change our system so that we're spending less, so that we have that money to use for other things is priority number one. It's
very apparent. I wouldn't be able to give statistics, but I know that the healthcare spending in the U.S. is quite high, I believe.
90% of GDP, which is about double second place developed country. But in terms of outcomes, absolutely not the best outcomes.
Yeah. In the past few days of meeting with different individuals in the Senate and the representatives, just the importance of this topic right now.
Mm-hmm. Hey, I'm going to put a link to your paper in the show notes. So last question I ask people is if they're really interested in this topic and they want to learn more, can you recommend a book, a podcast, another paper?
Richard Thaler, famous Nobel laureate economist, he talks about default choices. And one of the interesting things that he promotes, and I think you see a lot today in policy, is now when people enroll into work, they have automatic contributions. Instead of having to set up, instead of the default being, no, I'm not going to enroll in a retirement, the default is you are in a retirement and then you have to opt out. And that default, that architecture, that choice architecture has been really crucial, I think, to getting a lot of people enrolled. The second part he talks about is that a lot of people don't like this idea. I have to take money out of my account, out of my wages, and put it into retirement. He proposes this idea where instead, when you get salary increases, a percentage of those go towards retirements. So that way people, when they receive a salary increase, they move up to another level, they get an extra 10 grand. They're still getting $2,000 or $4,000 out of that to go into their pocket. But that other $5,000 is being set aside. And so instead of feeling like you're receiving this burden when you first start out, to increasingly do it that way. And I haven't seen if any experiments have rolled out on that, but I think that there's good ideas behind it, especially with the work he's done. So I would say Richard Thaler has some wonderful pieces on this.
Brock Wilson, thank you so much for being on the podcast today.
Thank you again, Andrew.
Thank you, listeners. If you like what you heard, please subscribe, rate, and review us. To contact me, email rep.andrew.gray@akleg.gov or call 907-465-4940.